It is my pleasure now to welcome very officially Rabbi Gilad Kariv. I'm going to try to spotlight him so everyone can see. Yes, there, that worked. Rabbi Kariv, you're everything now. Rabbi Kariv is the first Reform rabbi to serve in the Knesset. We were speaking before the program opened about how literally no one knows what it's like to sit in his seat but him, because no one else has ever done this. So he is here in the auspices of his role as an Anshe Knesset, but in addition, Rabbi Kariv was the president and CEO of the IMPJ, Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism, and he also served as the associate director of the Israel Religious Action Center. In addition to that, he sits on the Knesset as chair of the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee and has a unique perspective in particular through those eyes as well. And I'm sure he'll share a little bit about that with us in a few moments. We are so honored to have you with us and grateful. Everyone who's here should know that Rabbi Kariv really went out of his way to make this possible for us. And he turned down other programs to be here with us. And it's 8 p.m. in Israel, so he's working after hours. We are humbled, honored that you're here with us. We turn the Zoom over to you.
Great. So, shalom, dear friends. Shavua tov. It's wonderful to be with you, and thank you for the kind invitation and for this initiative to bring together the Chicago area Reform congregations together for an open discussion about the challenges and the opportunities we have today in Israel, 6 months after the new Knesset started its term and 4 months after the new government, this very unique and special government started its term. Thank you for Rabbi Geffen. Thank you for your kind introduction. One piece was missing, and that's the special place I have in my heart for the Chicago Reform congregation for two great reasons. One is the fact that your community for many years now is a very strong and supportive partner of our movement in Israel. It can be seen in the bi-congregational relations between many of our communities in Israel and many of the Chicago area Reform congregations. It can be seen in the ongoing support of your Jewish Federation for the work of our movement in Israel, and the Chicago Jewish Federation was one of the pioneering Jewish federations that identified the importance of promoting religious pluralism in Israel. And we know that the leaders, the rabbis and the lay leaders of the Reform congregations in the Chicago area were extremely involved in creating this venue of support. And on a personal note, I had the pleasure of studying a summer semester in Northwestern. And the truth is that instead of hearing the great law professors of Northwestern, I used most of my time to travel around your congregations. And it was more than 12 years ago, but I have great memories from a very exciting and inspiring summer with most of the congregations that are well represented in this webinar, in this Zoom discussion. So thank you. And I want to thank the rabbis and the lay leaders that initiated this discussion. I want to leave enough room for your questions. So I will go directly to share with you a few thoughts that I have around the topic of our discussion. And the main message I want to convey to you is that in many ways, the current era or the current political situation in Israel represents for us as reform, progressive, liberal Jews in Israel and in North America, mainly great opportunities. I'm saying mainly because we are not naive and we are fully aware to the fact that the current political situation in Israel brings with it also many challenges, and I will address them. But I think that after many years or some years of deep frustration, we have a new situation. And if we know how to deal with it, and if we know how to use it carefully and wisely, we will not, of course, solve all the problems, and we're not going to address all the challenges, but we definitely can achieve some progress in important fields. And in order to share with you what I mean by saying that this is an era of opportunities, please remember that although this is not the first time that we have a unity government in Israel, and actually the first unity government in Israel that brings together left and right was formed immediately after the 6 Days War, and we had some successful and less successful terms of unity governments during the 80s and the 90s. Still, the current unity government is setting some important precedents in the political history of the state of Israel. And I'll share with you a few examples. This is the first government ever that includes an Arabic non-Zionist Israeli party, the United Arabic List, which is playing a very critical role in the current coalition and has a great impact on domestic issues between the Jewish majority and the Arab minority. This is the first government in Israel which is led by an Orthodox Jew, a modern Orthodox Israeli Jew, wearing a kippah, coming from the ranks of the Israeli modern Orthodoxy. The number of women in the Israeli government and in our coalition is setting a new precedent. We're not yet celebrating an egalitarian or fully egalitarian political situation, but we see a dramatic growth in the number of women serving in the Israeli government and taking leadership role in the current coalition. And I can give you more and more examples for the uniqueness of the current government and the current coalition. I don't want to spend my time on this idea that in many ways Israel is experiencing a type of political and ideological leadership that we never experienced before, and a type of political and ideological partnership that we never experienced before. Now, if you are willing to embrace the concept or the notion that one of the main challenges of the Israeli society in recent years are the internal conflicts. We are caught with the long existing challenge of our relations with the Palestinians, of course, and the occupation, and we know about it. But I think that if you look carefully into the sociological reality in Israel in recent years, you can easily identify the fact that the domestic debates and conflicts became to be a real threat to the strength of the Israeli society. And I assume that as Americans, you can also embrace this notion, looking at things that are happening today in your country. And in that regard, the current government in Israel is mainly based on an attempt to address those domestic and internal conflicts. Now, this is a very important point, and it should be kept as an important point when we are talking about the expectations of North American Jews from the current government, because almost by definition, this government will not present a major breakthrough in regard to the future solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. By definition, because this is a unity government, it's not a central left government. Not all parts of the government are embracing the concept of two-state solution. Actually, the current prime minister opposes the solution of two independent states side by side. And unless we understand that right now, the most important challenge we are facing in Israel is the domestic debate. And without addressing this debate, it will be extremely hard to move slowly to deal in a more sophisticated way with the external challenges. One might be confused or disappointed from the current government, because this is a government that cannot bring great solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But again, if you are willing to understand that right now, after the last few years of Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, the main challenge we are dealing with is the domestic debate, you understand that this government can cure or start to cure this existential threat to the Israeli democracy and to the social fabric of the Israeli society. The other thing we need to identify as a great opportunity has to do with religion and state issues. And here it's important for me to say, in a minute I will address the fact that I'm the first Israeli Reform rabbi serving in the Knesset. But even if you place aside our, particular achievement as Reform Jews by having direct representation in the Knesset, I think that the current government and the current coalition represent or create a real window of opportunities for those that would like to see a strategic shift in the way Israel is dealing with the issues of religion and state. And we are all aware to the impact or the influence that those issues have on the relations between Israel and diaspora communities, mainly your community in North America. The fact that right now the ultra-Orthodox parties are not included in the coalition, and that the modern Orthodox parties that are included represent the more moderate side of this Orthodox Israeli community, create a real opportunity for us to move forward in some of the most important fields or arenas of state and religion relations. Probably we will not be able to solve all the critical issues in the next year or two, but we can definitely create a momentum of moving forward. And here I can already share with you that we are celebrating some achievements. For the first time in the history of the state of Israel, we are going to have a governmental unit, part of the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs that deals not with progressive or reform congregations overseas, but also with the need to grow and to support the non-Orthodox movements in Israel. And for the first time, 3 days ago, we approved the national budget after more than 2 years that Israel didn't have a national budget. Not like in the US, it doesn't mean that our administration must shut down. The concept of financial accountability is a little bit different in Israel, unfortunately. So we have a constitutional mechanism that allows us to keep running without a national budget. But one of the great achievements of the new government is that we have now a very good, I think, national budget. And for the first time in the history of Israel, there is a budget line of supporting the non-Orthodox movements in Israel. Now, we are not yet entered the promised land of full equality. And still there is a deep financial and political discrimination against our communities, rabbis, and movements, but we are starting to correct this historic mistake of the founding fathers and mothers of our country. And this is only one example. The modern Orthodox Party, the Prime Minister Party, initiated a huge reform in the kashrut operation in Israel that goes directly against the more traditional establishments of Orthodoxy in Israel. We are now starting to deal with, in a more serious way, with other major issues of religion and state, with conversion issues, with issues of marriage and divorce, public transportation on Shabbat. Again, after 73 years, it's not going to be a rapid revolution, but I can say that if for years we were trained just to hold our positions and to make sure that we're not being pushed backwards in the arena of religion and state, we have now a real opportunity to move forward in many, many arenas, including the Kotel. I'm sure you saw the pictures and you read the headlines about the last Rosh Chodesh of the Women of the Wall. 2 days ago, I was approached by the President of the State of Israel not to come to the wall this last Friday, but in exchange, for the first time, the President of the State of Israel said, I'm starting to be involved in this issue of the Kotel. And I assume that in the coming few weeks, the Israeli government will announce the Supreme Court that we are renewing the efforts to implement the Kotel agreement. And this is a direct result of the structure of the new government. And basically, all partners today in the government embrace the concept that we need to renew the Kotel agreement. My last remark, and then we'll open it for your questions, has to do with the relations between Israel and the Jewish communities around the world, and mainly the North American community. And here I do want to talk about an opportunity, but also about the challenge that we need to address together. The opportunity, I believe, is well understood. If we have a government which is much more tolerant, which is a government which tolerates the concept of religious pluralism, a government which is basically committed to advance the concept of religious pluralism, it is clear that it is also a government which is fully committed to the strength and the health of the relations between Israel and all Jewish denominations, communities, and movements. And here we need to be very clear. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that initiated the Kotel Agreement originally, in the last few years turned its back to the non-Orthodox, liberal, progressive, reform communities in the Jewish world, especially in North America. It wasn't a secret. This is something that he and his teams said out loud. He basically refused to meet our leadership since 2017. And it was a very clear political and ideological decision of him to build a strong alliance with the ultra-Orthodox parties and establishments in Israel. And by definition, this government, and it is well stated in its basic policy lines, this government is taking a totally different position. The Labour Party is now leading the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. This was one of our demands, and I think that all players in the coalition understood why it is the right time to hand this ministry to a party which is committed to religious pluralism. If you hear the statements of Prime Minister Bennett and the Deputy Prime Minister Yair Lapid, you understand that this is a major element of the foreign policy of the current government, and we start to see also that this new understanding is implemented into concrete actions. And in that regard, I think that the leadership of our communities, the leadership of our movements must identify this window of opportunity and to invest new energy and new efforts in building strong and productive relations with all elements of the current government, including the right-wing parties that are part of the current coalition. We need to make sure that people like Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and the Minister of Justice Gideon Saar and other right-wing figures in the current government are well exposed to our communities around the world, to our values, to our challenges, and to the role we are playing in securing the future of the Jewish people outside the state of Israel. It leads me, and I will conclude with it, it leads me also to one challenge that we need to face together. It's not a secret that today the relations of the state of Israel and the United States, and also the relations between Israel and the more progressive Jewish community in North America, are being challenged not only from the right, but also from the left. And here I would like carefully to suggest that the same way we understand we have today a window of opportunities to create some changes in the Israeli reality, to make it more pluralistic, more open-minded, more egalitarian. We also need to understand that right now we have a window of opportunities also to deal with the way Israel is being seen and understood by the more progressive political forces in the United States. Now, this is a great challenge. We are not allowed as Reform Jews to close our eyes to the fact that only 2 weeks ago, important organizations refused to sit at the same table with the Religious Action Center of the Reform movement in North America because they identify themselves as a Zionist organization. As Reform Jews, as liberal Jews, as progressive Jews, we must also acknowledge the challenges that we have in all of our political camps in Israel and in the US. Now we know that no conservative Israeli conservative politicians have nothing to say to progressive American communities, political communities. They are not the ones that are invited. They are not the ones that can talk about those issues. And we have a special role to play both in Israel and in the US in making sure that people understand the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian reality. The fact that this government really offers a different discourse than the former government, that even if we are still led by a prime minister that doesn't embrace the concept of two states, Prime Minister Bennett, his basic attitude to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is different than Netanyahu's approach. And I'm calling all of us to think how we are using the current situation in Israel, political situation in Israel, not only as an opportunity in regard to the relations between Israeli Jews and North American Jews, but also how we meet together the challenges that we have with some of the current political discourses in the more progressive side of American politics, because if we are not the ones to deal with this challenge, this arena will be left aside. I will stop here, Rabbi Geffen, and I suggest we'll move to the question and answers. And I welcome your leadership again.
No, my leadership will be brief and quiet here. On behalf of all of us, though, I will thank you for sharing so much with us, so concisely, but so much critical information that I know all of us who sit here in America yearn for, and to have an assessment from a voice that we know and trust really is so valuable. So we are grateful to you for everything you've shared with us thus far. As I mentioned at the beginning, there were 2 questions submitted in advance, and then there are now a number of questions populating in the chat. So we'll get through as many as we can together while honoring time. The first question that was submitted in advance, you actually spoke to already, but I want to draw the end line of this question and just ask for your reflection on it. The first question was, will, in your opinion, the current coalition government survive if the Kotel agreement is implemented? So not if it's processed, but actually in its implementation, do you believe the coalition will survive?
The answer is yes. I don't think that the current government and coalition are under any real threat from the implementation of the Kotel agreement. I do think that we need to understand that we might be asked to do some adjustments. In the end, the Kotel agreement was extremely detailed. We invested hundreds of hours in crafting all parts and elements, the physical and the legal elements of the agreement, together with the leadership of the North American Reform movement and conservative movement, the Jewish Federations of North America, and of course the political players in Israel. Now, by definition, when you want to embrace again an agreement that was signed in 2016, you might need to fine tune it. You might need to look carefully into some of its details. But the basic concept of creating and establishing an egalitarian platform, which is well established both from a physical aspect, but also from a legal aspect, this basic element can be implemented, and I don't think it creates any real threat. Yet, and here it's important message to convey, yet it demands public pressure. And it's important for all of us to understand, okay, even a supportive government that is willing to embrace, again, the Kotel agreement should be pushed to do so, because the plate is so full with other issues that we need to remind the Israeli leaders that we care about those issues. I will do it in the Knesset together with other Knesset members that are committed to this subject, but we need the North American Reform and Conservative communities to signal that in the last 5 years we didn't forget the need to repair the situation in the Kotel. And the combination of the new government, its structure, and the ongoing pressure, positive pressure from the Jewish world, I believe will bring us to a much better situation in regard to the Kotel.
I'm going to break the rule that I just said, because there's a question that asks you to expand on something you just brought up, which is, can you talk about the effect of pressure from the diaspora? Do our communications, our letters and emails actually make a difference? This question isn't specific to the Kotel agreement. Of course, it's specific. It's not specific. It's to anything. But can you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah. Look, I always said, I said it as one of the leaders of the Israeli reform movement. I always said that again and again we see that the public, political, ideological pressure that comes from diaspora communities can really impact the Israeli political reality. The only reason why in the last 73 years we didn't have a conversion legislation in Israel that ends a monopoly over conversion into the arms of the Orthodox establishment is the political pressure and the communal pressure from diaspora communities. And I know that sometimes when you send an email to the Israeli consulate or to the embassy in DC, you say, well, they get thousands of emails every day. They don't care about an email of a Reformed Jew from Chicago. This is not the case. And I'm telling you that after I spoke with dozens of Israeli ambassadors and general counsels. Your emails, your letters, your phone calls make a difference. And in that regard, I really want you to identify. Sometimes we tend to think about the big political headlines. And we forget that with the new government, there is a chain reaction, a political chain reactions that goes very far. And one of the examples is the new music you can hear today in the Israeli embassy in DC. And I need to say that unfortunately, in the last few years, our leaders were not invited to the Israeli embassy in DC. The Jewish leaders that were invited to the Hanukkah party, both in the Israeli embassy and in the White House, till a year ago, were the leaders of the Orthodox community in North America. and the lines of communication between Rabbi Rick Jacobs, the president of the Union of Reform Judaism, to the former Israeli ambassador in DC were not truly working. There is a new government in Israel, and suddenly the ambassador in DC is someone which is deeply involved in Israel diaspora relations. Mike Herzog is the brother of President Yitzhak Herzog, and for years he worked for the institution of the policy of the Jewish people, a think tank of the Jewish Agency. And he's coming from the progressive side of the Israeli society. The new General Counsel in New York, which is in many ways is responsible for the relations with North American Jewry, was married by a Reform rabbi, my rabbi in Tel Aviv, Rabbi Meir Azari. He identifies himself as a half Reform Jew and half secular Israeli. Right? So you need to understand that suddenly it's not only about the pressure you can place, it's also about the communication you can create. You need to make sure that the representatives of the State of Israel are welcomed in our congregations, hear from our rabbis. There is a new opportunity here, and you know, we have a chance to achieve many achievements through your dialogue with the Israeli government. The fact that we have a Reform rabbi in the Knesset doesn't mean that we can place aside all the non-formal communication lines that we had with the Israeli governments in the past. On the contrary, it forces us to be more vocal, more active in order to meet this unique opportunity that we have today.
Thank you so much. This is a different question in a totally different realm. And I'm just going to read it verbatim. With this current government, there might not be a path to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but is it possible for there to be a different way of dealing with the occupation? When we hear that 6 Palestinian human rights organizations are being banned because Gantz claimed that they are funding terrorist organizations, but doesn't provide evidence, it's hard to see that this government is different vis-a-vis the conflict than before. Additionally, we continue to see violence perpetrated by settlers against Palestinians. Can this government do anything to change how the occupied territories are administered?
So, look, I want to be honest and realistic. I think that when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's much more difficult to talk about major opportunities with this new government. I said it in the beginning, I'm repeating it because we need to be honest and transparent with our voters in Israel and also with our Jewish brothers and sisters around the world. Unfortunately, we still don't have the majority in the Israeli Knesset to re-establish the political reality we had in 1992 with the second Rabin government. Still, I think that we need to identify those specific areas that this government can offer a new approach and a new perspective. And we are not allowed to undermine the things that are happening because it's very easy to say, well, this government is exactly like the former one when it comes to the Palestinians. And with all the respect to the Kotel Agreement and to the status of Reform communities in Israel, the big moral issue is the occupation and not religion and state issues. And we start to hear those tunes, both in Israel and in diaspora and in our diaspora communities. And we need here to be serious enough in order to say what we will not achieve, but also what can be achieved. And please remember, for example, that the former government was obsessed about the issue of annexation. And we were very, very close to the annexation of major parts of Judea and Samaria. And this government, which is not a center-left government, is formally saying that there will be no annexation. It's not part of the policies of this government. Another example, yes, this government will renew some of the building plans in the existing settlements, but it is quite clear that the current government is not going to build new settlements in a serious manner. So maybe there is an headline about one outpost in Samaria, but if we are serious, we need to acknowledge the fact that this government, which is led by a former CEO of the Settlements Council, is not going to build new settlements. Talking about the defense minister and his decision, I will say carefully that the fact that the evidences are not in regard to those 6 human rights or civil society organizations, the fact that the evidences are not presented in the media doesn't mean that there is no real base for the decision. I'm not saying that I'm supporting this decision. I don't know enough in order to say something smart about this decision. I know that the ministers of the Labour Party and Meretz Party, the 2 left-wing Zionist parties in the government, will be exposed to the evidences. And I also know that the United Arabic List, which is part of the coalition, is not leaving the coalition because of this decision. And one of the reasons they are not leaving this decision is because Benny Gantz went to meet Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah. And 2 days after this decision about the 6 civil society Palestinian organizations, the defense minister, the same defense minister, Gantz, came with a package of economic gestures towards the Palestinian Authority. So if we want to judge seriously the policies of our defense minister, we cannot address only the decision to ban 6 civil society Palestinian organizations. We also need to talk about the fact that he renewed, after years of not acknowledging the Palestinian Authority as a political player, this government is renewing its direct relations with the Palestinian Authority. This government, not like Netanyahu's government, instead of strengthening Hamas in Gaza, is working to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. So I think that one of our duties is to share with people that the picture in regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now is more complicated than Israel is deepening the occupation. Okay, I'm deeply troubled with the situation in the West Bank, with the violence of settlers. We are working as a party, the left side of the coalition is working hard to deal with it, but the picture is much more complicated and balanced than the one which is presented by how to say, more vocal left-wing players, both in Israel and in North American political arenas.
So let me jump right from there to a few questions. I'll try to kind of bunch them together. There's a question that asks, how in your mind would you tell us that we should dialogue as Reformed Jews in America? The question asks for the very far left, but I think you could also apply it to the very far right, whichever seat we sit in, to whichever direction we're talking about. What would that dialogue look like? And what would you see as effective policies or approaches for bridge building? And then there is an add-on to that, which is sort of noting on, and I'm going to expand it to either side, a lack of knowledge about the history of the Jewish people, Judaism, and Israel. And this question specifically calls out the non-Jewish community. So how might we also educate, in particular, the non-Jewish community about Judaism, about Israel in these conversations, in these dialogues?
So look, I'm talking about the Israeli reality, but I assume that many of you will feel that it is relevant also to the American reality. One of the things that we identified in Israel, and again, I think this is relevant to many Western societies today, is that the extreme discourse from the two sides of the political ideological sequence is dominating the public debate, and that the voice of the more centralized majority from right and left, the voice of the majority is not well represented in the public debate. It has to do with the issues of the new media, the fake news culture, the collapse of the more traditional political establishments. I'm not an expert, but I'm sure that we share the same frustrations in that regard. And I think that one of the things we need to convey to North American audiences, both Jewish audiences and the general American audience, is that the new government in Israel represents the majority, or is pushing back the extreme voices from the right and from the left. That the organizing concept of the current government in Israel is to bring together those forces from right and left that are committed to a joint agenda. And I think this is the most important message we need to share with our communities, with the surrounding circles around our communities, and with our political leaders in Israel and your political leaders in North America. That in many ways, not identifying this basic guiding line of the Israeli government is to miss a huge opportunity. We need to convince left-wing Jews and non-Jews in America that today the right-wing prime minister in Israel is someone you can dialogue with, and to convince the right-wing American Jews and non-Jews that the left-wing leaders in the Israeli governments are also people you can communicate with. And that the threat to the Israeli-American relations come mainly from the extreme voices from the two sides, in Israeli politics and in American politics. And I think, and not without jumping into partisan American politics, because this is, thank God, this is not my responsibility. I think that, again, regardless to partisan issues, you don't have the concept of unity government, the structure of governance is different, but the two administrations in a way, the American current administration and the Israeli current administration are trying to push aside the extreme voices from left and right, and it creates a new common ground for those two administrations. After too many years that Israel placed aside the bipartisan traditional policy, and this is one of the major mistakes of the former prime minister, Israel is back, is holding back the bipartisan policy in regard to what is happening in DC. And this is a great opportunity. Now, in regard to the educational piece, I would like to suggest that our main challenge and duty is first and foremost to educate our younger generation and not the non-Jewish audiences around the world. In the end, the best messengers for our values, the way we understand Zionism, for the way we understand the need for a Jewish state, but also the need for it to be a real strong, vibrant democracy, the best messengers are American Jews themselves. They're the ones that will talk with their non-Jewish friends and colleagues. And in that regard, I think we, again, have an opportunity today to go to the younger generation of our communities, young people that for many years feel frustrated with what they see and what they hear from Israel, and to share with them that there is a new government and not everything we wish for will happen, but there are real opportunities today. And major threats to the Israeli democracy were placed aside with this new government. And there are real opportunities to do great things with the Arab minority inside Israel, and to promote equality and to promote recognition and reconciliation with the Arab minority in Israel. And it will lead also to good developments with the Palestinians. And we need first to educate our audiences. I heard for too many years that Israel is something that cannot be addressed peacefully from the pulpit in reform and conservative congregations in America. I really want to suggest that with the new political reality in Israel, it's time to bring back Israel to the American reform pulpit. That if Prime Minister Naftali Bennett can sit with Merav Michaeli together, and if I as a reform leader can sit together with a modern Orthodox prominent rabbi from the other side of the coalition, we can bring Israel back to the pulpit in America to talk openly about the challenges, to present the opportunities, and to remind our audiences that not everything is about politics. That Zionism is also about reviving the Hebrew language. That Zionism is also about reviving Judaism. That Zionism also is about creating strong bonds between Israeli Jews and Jews that live full Jewish life outside Israel. And I suggest that if we play it right, we must see the current situation in Israel not only as a political opportunity, but also as an ideological opportunity to renew our Israeli discourse in progressive audiences inside the Jewish world. If we succeed to do that, it will expand itself to larger circles around our communities, Jewish circles and non-Jewish circles. And of course, we are looking forward to have you with us in Israel again, with all the booster vaccinations and everything. Start to plan your congregational trips to Israel back. You know, we are waiting for you.
Toda Rabbi, Rabbi Kariv, we are so grateful to you for spending your time and giving us your reflections, your insights, and honest ones at that, at the reality, and giving us hope, moving us forward in this month of darkness. You bring us light, and we are ever grateful for that. For all of those who are here on this Zoom, who are a part of one of the sponsoring congregations, this recording will be sent to your respective congregations, and I'm sure they will make it available for you and your fellow congregants. And anyone else can go to any of the sponsoring congregations' websites, I'm sure, and find that recording as well. On behalf of all of us, thank you. And Rabbi Kariv, we hope this is your last appointment of the evening, and that you get to go home and get some rest.
One before the last.
Oh, goodness. All right. Well, batzlacha. And to everyone here, thank you so much for joining us on in this incredible conversation. We are ever grateful.
Chanukah Sameach, friends. Shalom and thank you.